The wind howled through the barren Kansas plains, carrying with it a sense of foreboding that seemed to seep into the very bones of those who dared to traverse the Osage Trail. It was the late 1870s, a time when the promise of the West lured many into its vast, untamed wilderness. But not all who ventured into this desolate land would find fortune or freedom. Some, like those who crossed the threshold of the Bender family's inn, would find only death. The Bender Inn was a modest wooden structure, perched on the edge of the trail, the only sign of life for miles. To weary travelers, it appeared as a beacon of warmth and safety, a place where they could rest and find solace after long days of travel. The Bender family, a peculiar group of four, ran the establishment. There was John Sr., a grizzled old man with a thick German accent, his wife, Elvira, a cold, stern woman who rarely spoke, and their two children, John Jr. and Kate, both in their 20s. Kate, with her striking beauty and unsettling charm, was known to offer spiritual readings to guests, claiming she could commune with the dead. But it was all a facade, a lure to bring travelers closer, to keep them there just long enough for the family to strike. One particularly cold evening, a young couple on their way to the frontier stopped at the Bender Inn. They were newlyweds, full of hope and excitement for the new life that awaited them out west. The Benders welcomed them with eerie smiles, Kate insisting that the couple stay for a seance that night. She spoke of a mysterious energy in the air, of spirits restless and eager to communicate. The couple hesitated, but eventually agreed, thinking it would be a harmless way to pass the time. Little did they know they had just sealed their fate. As the seance began, the room grew unnaturally cold. Kate's eyes rolled back in her head, and she began to speak in a voice that was not her own, a guttural, malevolent whisper that sent shivers down the couple's spines. Suddenly the lanterns flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of scraping metal filled the air, followed by a sickening thud. When the lights flickered back on, the young couple was gone. The only sign they had ever been there was the pool of blood slowly spreading across the floor. John Jr. grinned, his teeth yellowed and sharp. "Another two for the collection," he muttered, as he and his father dragged the bodies through a hidden trapdoor in the floor. Down below, in the inn's cellar, the stench of death was overpowering. The walls were lined with crude wooden crosses, marking the graves of the countless victims who had met their end at the hands of the Benders. The couple's lifeless bodies were unceremoniously tossed onto a pile of rotting corpses, the latest additions to the Benders' grisly horde. But as John Sr. was about to cover the bodies, he froze. There, among the decaying remains, he saw something that shouldn't have been there. A small worn doll, its eyes black and hollow. He picked it up, a chill running down his spine as he realized it hadn't been there before. The doll's head slowly turned to face him, its mouth curling into a sinister grin. John Sr. recoiled, dropping the doll to the ground. As it hit the floor, the air grew thick with the sound of whispers. Voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, crying out for revenge. The Bender family had been careful, meticulous in their slaughter. But they had overlooked one thing: the restless spirits of their victims, now awakened and hungry for justice. The cellar door slammed shut, trapping John Sr. inside. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as the temperature plummeted. John Sr. backed into a corner, his breath visible in the freezing air. The doll slowly began to crawl toward him, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Suddenly the whispers stopped. There was silence, an eerie, suffocating silence. John Sr. looked around, panic rising in his chest. And then, without warning, the voices screamed, a deafening, soul-piercing scream that echoed through the inn, shaking its very foundations. Upstairs, the rest of the Bender family stopped in their tracks, their blood running cold as the screams of the damned filled the air. They knew in that moment that the spirits of their victims had come for them. But this was only the beginning. The true horror had yet to unfold. The oppressive silence that followed the ear-splitting screams seemed to stretch on forever. The rest of the Bender family, paralyzed with fear, huddled together in the dimly lit main room of the inn. Kate clutched a Bible to her chest, her eyes darting around the room as if she could sense the unseen forces that had taken hold of their home. John Jr. paced nervously, his usually cocky demeanor replaced with a growing sense of dread. Elvira, the matriarch of the family, stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace, her face a mask of cold indifference. They all knew something was terribly wrong, but none of them dared to speak it aloud. They couldn't. Not with the spirits of their countless victims now awakened and seeking retribution. Finally, Kate broke the silence. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't rest until they've taken us all. We have to get out of here." Elvira's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We will not run," she hissed. "This is our home. We've taken care of every last one of those wretches. They can't hurt us." But even as she spoke, the fire in the hearth suddenly roared to life, the flames turning a sickly green. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out toward the benders. The temperature in the room dropped, and a cold, unnatural wind blew through the inn, extinguishing the candles one by one until only the eerie green fire remained. John Jr. backed away from the fireplace, his eyes wide with terror.
"Mother, we have to go! We can't fight them!"
But Elvira stood her ground, her face twisted with rage. "They are nothing but shadows. We are the ones who hold the power here." As if in response, a heavy thud echoed from beneath the floorboards, followed by the sound of scratching, like nails dragging across wood. The noise grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out from the cellar. Kate's eyes filled with tears. "They're coming for us!" she sobbed. "Please, we have to leave." John Sr.'s voice suddenly boomed through the room, though his body remained trapped in the cellar. "You cannot escape! You belong to us now!" His words were followed by a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down the spine. In a desperate attempt to flee, John Jr. bolted toward the door, but as his hand grasped the doorknob, it seared his flesh as if the metal had been heated in a forge. He screamed in pain, pulling back his charred hand, only to see the door slowly swing open on its own. The darkness beyond the doorway was absolute. No moonlight, no stars, nothing but a void that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. And from that darkness emerged the faint outlines of figures, their forms barely visible in the shadowy depths. The benders could make out just enough to see that these figures were not human. Not anymore. The first figure stepped into the dim light of the inn, revealing the gaunt face of a man, his eyes hollow and lifeless. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his clothes hung in tatters, caked with dirt and blood. He was one of their victims, returned from the grave to exact his revenge. Behind him, more figures emerged. Men, women, even children. Each one a spectral reminder of the lives the benders had so callously snuffed out. Their faces were twisted with anger and pain, their eyes fixed on the family that had doomed them to a horrific death. Elvira tried to speak, but her voice failed her. For the first time, the iron-willed matriarch felt a true, paralyzing fear. The spirits were relentless, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. The inn itself seemed to tremble under the weight of their fury. Kate dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably as the specters advanced. "Please, we didn't mean to!" she cried, though she knew the words were empty. There was no forgiveness to be found here, only vengeance. The first ghost reached out with a bony hand, and as it touched Kate's face, her skin began to blister and peel, the flesh bubbling as if it had been plunged into boiling water. She screamed, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the inn, but the spirit did not relent. The others followed suit, each one reaching out to claim a piece of the Bender family's flesh. John Jr. tried to fight them off, swinging wildly at the phantoms, but his fists passed through them as if they were made of smoke. The ghosts closed in, their touch burning, slicing, tearing at the living until the room was filled with the scent of blood and charred meat. Elvira, the last one standing, looked around in horror as her family was torn apart before her eyes. The spirits of the dead were relentless, their fury unyielding, and their touch was like the icy grip of death itself. For the first time in her life, the woman who had orchestrated so much death and terror felt the cold hand of fear squeeze her heart. The ghosts advanced toward her, their eyes burning with the fires of the underworld. Their once human forms were now twisted, grotesque parodies of the people they had been in life, their faces contorted with the agony they had suffered at the hands of the Benders. Elvira backed away, her composure crumbling as the specters closed in. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The inn, once her sanctuary, had become her prison. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening as if the darkness itself was alive, hungry for vengeance. In a final act of defiance, Elvira raised her arms as if to ward off the spirits. "You will not take me!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the inn. But the spirits were unmoved. They were beyond anger, beyond pain, driven by a need for justice that could not be denied. As the first spirit reached her, Elvira felt an unbearable heat radiate from its form. The air around her grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. She could feel the life being drained from her, as if the spirits were siphoning away her very essence. Suddenly, the green flames in the hearth surged upward, consuming Elvira in a fiery inferno. Her screams joined those of her children, blending into a symphony of agony that echoed far into the night. The spirits watched, their faces impassive as the Bender family was reduced to ashes, their reign of terror finally at an end. But as the last ember flickered out, something strange began to happen. The dolls that had been scattered throughout the inn, the ones left behind by the victims, began to move. Slowly, they turned their heads to the charred remains of the Benders, their black eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. And then, in the dead silence of the night, one of the dolls began to laugh. A high-pitched, maniacal sound that echoed through the now empty inn. The sound grew louder, more frenzied, until it abruptly stopped. leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. The inn stood silent and abandoned for weeks, the air around it thick with the stench of decay. The townspeople, aware of the strange happenings, kept their distance, but whispers and rumors spread like wildfire. No one dared to venture near the Bender Inn, for it was said to be cursed, an unholy place where the line between the living and the dead had been shattered. Yet despite the fear and caution, the mystery of the Bender Inn continued to draw the curious and the brave. It was this dangerous curiosity that led a traveling journalist named Henry Carlisle to the inn. Henry was no stranger to tales of the macabre. He had built his career on documenting the strange and supernatural. When he heard the stories of the cursed inn and the disappearances surrounding it, he knew he had to see it for himself. Henry arrived at the inn just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. The building loomed before him, its windows dark and empty like the eyes of a long-dead corpse. The air was cold, unnaturally so for the season, and a chill ran down Henry's spine as he approached the front door. He hesitated, the warnings of the townsfolk echoing in his mind, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of the inn was just as he had imagined, dark, cold, and filled with an oppressive sense of dread. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved through the room. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each one louder than the last, until it felt as though the inn itself was amplifying the sound. Henry took out his lantern, the small flame flickering as it cast eerie shadows on the walls. He made his way to the fireplace, where he found the remnants of the last fire, now cold and lifeless. As he knelt to examine the ashes, a soft whisper reached his ears, a sound so faint that he almost dismissed it as the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and Henry's heart began to race as he realized it was a voice. A woman's voice, soft and pleading, as if calling out from beyond the grave. "Help me!" Henry froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, the lantern trembling in his hand as he scanned the room. But there was no one there. Nothing but the oppressive darkness pressing in on him from all sides. "Help me!" The voice was closer now, right behind him. Henry spun around, but again he saw nothing. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, taking on shapes that were almost human. Suddenly the floor beneath him groaned, and Henry felt a rush of air as the trapdoor to the cellar flew open, revealing the gaping maw of darkness below. The voice echoed up from the depths, louder now, more insistent. "Help me!" Against his better judgment, Henry felt compelled to descend into the cellar. He knew the stories, knew that no one who entered that place ever came back. But the voice, there was something in it that tugged at his very soul, a desperation that he couldn't ignore. He descended the creaking wooden steps, the lantern casting just enough light to see the narrow, dirt-floored cellar below. The smell was overwhelming. Decay, blood, and something else. Something older and more malevolent. The walls were lined with crude wooden crosses, and the ground was littered with bones, some half-buried, others disturbingly fresh. But it was the sight in the center of the room that stopped Henry in his tracks. There, surrounded by a circle of rotting corpses, was the doll. The same doll that had haunted the Benders and the sheriff's men. It sat upright, its black eyes glinting in the lantern light, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. And beside it, lying on the cold, damp earth, was a woman. She was pale, her dress torn and stained with blood. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips moving as she continued to whisper that desperate plea. "Help me!" Henry rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear and urgency. But before she could answer, the cellar door slammed shut above them, trapping them in darkness. The lantern flickered, then died, plunging the room into pitch black. The whispers began again, but this time they were not the woman's. They were the voices of the dead, the countless victims of the Bender family, their cries filling the air with a cacophony of rage and pain. Henry felt something cold wrap around his wrist, a hand, skeletal and strong, pulling him back. He struggled, but more hands grasped at him, dragging him toward the pile of corpses. The woman reached out to him, her eyes pleading, but she was fading, her form dissolving into the shadows as the voices grew louder, more insistent. The last thing Henry saw before the darkness consumed him was the doll, its eyes glowing with an unholy light, its mouth opening wide as it began to speak in a voice that was not its own, a voice that was both human and something else entirely. "We are the Benders," it hissed. "And you are ours now," Henry screamed as the hands pulled him down, his voice joining the chorus of the damned. The cellar floor opened beneath him, revealing a chasm of swirling shadows and fire, and he was dragged into the abyss, the doll's laughter echoing in his ears as he fell. The Bender Inn was silent once more, the only sign of the horrors within the faint glow of the doll's eyes. peering out from the darkness of the cellar. The inn would stand for years to come, its walls soaked with the blood of the innocent, its secrets buried deep within the earth. But those who ventured too close, drawn by curiosity or fate, would hear the whispers, those desperate pleading whispers, calling them to their doom. And the Benders would wait in the shadows for their next victim. And so the tale of the Bloody Benders of Kansas comes to its chilling conclusion. But remember, dear viewer, some places are better left forgotten, some doors better left unopened. For you never know what horrors might be lurking in the darkness waiting. Just waiting. For you. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.